The cases of the children who never returned continued to resonate through Greentown, an aftershock settling over the town once more. The closed school had become an elephantine presence. For Oliver, as the years passed, the feeling of guilt and sorrow never seemed to abate. He would endeavor to seek answers, but they remained for him out of reach. The story of the vanished boys would be forever retold as a children's tale, a ghost story. It was something that the grown-ups, who knew better, would never, ever speak aloud. Echoing down the years, it would remind us of a murder that it was better not to solve. Marcus's disappearance never erased the spirit of Greentown, although the atmosphere became heavier in the years following Noah's disappearance. Now, silence characterized Greentown. Its atmosphere was like a ghostly breeze, like the ones creeping through the empty halls of Greentown Elementary School. The giant facade of the school, surrounded by parking lots, sank its long shadows over Greentown. Meanwhile, the shadow of that one night hung over Oliver every day. The thought of Noah meeting his death, moaning for help that never came. Oliver, now 30 years old, had decided to spend the rest of his life investigating the origins of Greentown Elementary School. Guilt-ridden, he searched through archives, interviewed former pupils and teachers, and grew knowledgeable of the local folklore and legends surrounding the school. He found, using old newspaper clippings and reports from the school board, that the school was built in the early 1900s, and cases of unclassified disappearances had already started around the time. All the cases were similar. During a rainy afternoon in the county's archives, Oliver found the name of Jacob William Davis, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up, as he remembered this was the name on the book, which he and Noah found in the school library on that horrifying evening. In a yellow leather-bound journal from 1910, written about Jacob's life and legacy, Oliver started reading Jacob's connection to the school's wicked history. Jacob William Davis was born in the late 1800s in Greentown, a small community where everyone knew their neighbor. He was a strange boy, with an unnatural fondness for books about ancient rites and dark magic. His parents didn't like it, but they tried not to make a big fuss. After all, the boy was only a child. Over the years, Jacob's turn to the occult had grown deeper and stronger. He began his seances, which were his attempts at summoning and communicating with the spirits and harnessing the forces of darkness. The townsfolk became more and more uneasy. The rumors were in full flow, with more eyes following Jacob's work. Yet the young boy persisted, even more so since it was becoming clear to him that he might be cracking a perceived code to the mysteries of the universe, closed off to the ordinary mind. Then, in 1905, tragedy struck. Jacob was found dead under apparently mysterious circumstances in his house, surrounded by the accoutrements of his dark rites. Local authorities ruled it an accident, but rumors persisted of a botched ritual causing an apoplectic reaction, or a vengeful spirit snuffing out his life. And, not long after, the house was vacated. The ghosts of Jacob's life settled over it, and the townsfolk did their best to put the whole sorry affair behind them. A few years after Jacob's death, a public school was built on the site of his house. No thought was given to the history of the land, and the new school became a focal point for the community. From the start, strange events haunted the building. Students and staff reported hearing unexplained noises, cold spots, and dark figures. The first such disappearance was in 1923, when Peter, a little boy of 8, went missing from school. He was never seen or heard from again. The community was, of course, shocked, and the police were called. Nothing ever came of it. Then slowly, over the decades, another child vanished, and then another, always in perfect similarity to the others. The disappearances were few and far between. They stretched over decades sometimes, with not even a single victim for a decade or more in between. But knowing what came before, those eras of safety were punctuated with a sense of foreboding and healthy suspicion. After digging into the history of Greentown, Oliver learned everything about Jacob and his connection to the school. From old diaries and letters, he had begun to piece together Jacob's story, and eventually, his death. It seemed that Jacob had tried to wrest control of some spirit as part of a last ritual. A spirit who had been stronger than he had anticipated, whom he did not want to subjugate, but only to bind to himself, to give him immortality and a knowledge of things greater than mortal understanding. In the disaster that followed, he had had his knowledge, but had lost his life to it as well. The spirit of Jacob was full of vengeance, taking up residence where he died, haunting the place, and seeking retribution. With the school built on the location where Jacob met his demise, the evil spirit moved in, and then the children started to vanish into its evil grasp. The spirit fed off their dread and horror, growing more powerful with each future target. Jacob's spirit had grown into a grotesque and malignant essence. His twisted psyche was going after children, subjugating their minds through misdirection and purpose-built games and traps, simpler and stranger than anything Jacob had ever dreamed up for himself in the years before his death. The gibberish, the occult scrapbooks and rituals, that freaky recursive art project, they were all games, riddles, relics of Jacob's days spent in underworld circles of young schoolyard misfits. They were rigged for a visitor with curiosity and enough patience to push the chain of associations to the bitter end. The goal of the spirit is to continue the task that Jacob began, and the children's lives are the fuel by which it gains ever more strength. Each disappearance is a sacrifice, a step along the path to feeding speed to this dark thing that Jacob let loose. The spirit infects the mind and the soul, driving its victims to a horrific madness and a terrible death. With the knowledge of Jacob's past, the only conceivable way to stop the disappearances was to confront the spirit in the school, where it all started. The first thing Oliver did upon returning to Greentown was head down into the school's basement and investigate. Among the old books and cobwebs, symbols scored into the walls mirrored the writings of Jacob himself, and although these were clearly meant to bind the spirit to place and time, Oliver had to improvise and repurpose them for banishment. The energy in the blackened space was oppressive with malevolence pervading the air. Oliver got to work right away, laying out his materials, candles, chalk, to draw protective sigils, and a very old book given to him by a voodoo practitioner who taught him the banishment spell. His heart was beating so fast, and he started to intone the chant while he burned the candle. It echoed strangely in the tiny space, and the shadows seemed to leak more into the room than was natural, squeezing in all around him. Before he could even raise his elbow to protect his face, the spirit attacked, its body heaving and leaning in the shadows. Oliver was slammed into the wall, smacking the side of his head against the stone's hard gray surface. Destructive pinpoints of white obliterated his vision as his head struck the wall, and he desperately fought to remain awake. Frothing with rage, the spirit crouched over him, a living malevolent cobweb before Oliver's own eyes. The spirit paused for a moment, standing face to face with Oliver, saying,
"I remember you. Oliver, isn't it? Yes. I never forget a face. You're the coward who left your friend to die."
"Not true," cried Oliver and continued, "I went for help. He was my best." The spirit interrupted Oliver mid-sentence, saying,
"Your best? What? Friend? Oh, the pain and agony he went through because of you. Look what has become of your so-called best friend. Behold."
It was then a luminous, diabolical image of Noah formed with the look of misery on his face. As it moved closer, a devastated Oliver fell to his knees in shame, quietly crying, "Noah? Oh no!" The evil spirit said,
"Look into his eyes, Oliver, and see what you have done to him. See how much he hates you, Oliver. You were the one who ran scared that night, only concerned with your own safety. You were the one who deserted him. And Noah trusted you, a misplaced trust, Oliver, just as I warned Noah that night. Beware of whom you trust. His mistake was placing his life in the hands of a weak coward like you, Oliver. Now, Noah's soul is mine forever.
It was then that Oliver stood up, and with an intense determination he screamed, "You lie, Jacob!" The spirit was surprised that Oliver knew his identity. Oliver continued, "Yes, I know all about you. A mad little boy with a twisted obsession that caused your own destruction. Jacob, I know how to defeat you." In a fury of adrenaline, he reached for the book and began the next portion of the invocation. The shadow shrieked again, a sound that reached into his soul, but it recoiled, and for a moment, he was safe. On his feet at last, his limbs returning, his breast heaving, and his eyes blind with tears, Oliver carried on. As Oliver finally sketched out the final protective symbols and was beginning to sing, the room began to shake. Desk lamps wobbled, books toppled from shelves. Debris came down from the considerable fronds of the raftered ceiling. The spirit had returned, and in a fit of fury at Oliver's defiance, it came back to him for a second round. More forcefully and ominously, it rammed him, sending the chalk flying from his hand and the candles scattering. Oliver's heart was pounding hard, trying quickly to regain his ground. The spirit was on his back, his ghost-like form floating around, sticking cold fingers into his flesh. The energy was rapidly leaving his body, the malignant evil sucking away Oliver's willpower. Desperation was slowly taking over him. Oliver yelled and ripped the book off the cover again. This time, all the pages were scattered, but the last incantation was visible. Oliver began the voice chant. In another moment, it seemed that the spirit was screaming back, and the room was icing over more and more. It got darker, almost smothering. He involuntarily stopped a couple of times, and sinister images danced in the room before his eyes. But then he took a deep and determined breath again, his voice getting louder and stronger. The spirit lashed out then with such a fury that for a second he felt his life ebbing away, and so violently that it sent him flying through the air, crashing into a bookshelf, splintering wood and hurling books all over. He felt the pain of being overwhelmed, but he mustered his strength and pulled himself up. The spirit came at him again, now in a more solid shape, charged with malevolence, more dense, more ominous. Oliver knew that he had to complete the ritual quickly, and, picking up a fallen candle, he relit it, groping for the partly scattered pages of the book by the faint glow from the flame. The spirit was almost upon him. Its hot red eyes were burning with rage, and its long, crooked fingers reached out to grab him. Just then, before the evil spirit could reach him, Oliver chanted the end of the spell. Azathoth, the ravenous space zeppelin, entropic Shoggoth in the synapse, was the last he would say. Kabeg Gala Nak Dos. The spirit was finally subdued, falling limp to the ground with Oliver pinning him with his forearm, finally having the upper hand. Oliver looked into the spirit's eyes and said in a confident, low, deep voice, "Playtime is over, Jacob. I have had enough of you." From the symbols on the floor appeared a blinding light, pushing the spirit backward out of the room, and its evil form swirled to smoke. The light leaped higher and higher, warmth flowing into the room, driving out the cold, driving out the dark. With that last shuddering of earth, the atmosphere of the room lifted, and he heard an odd hissing silence. He fell, senseless, to the floor. He had done it. His task was complete, the curse broken. The ghosts of those dead children, no longer imprisoned by the evil spirit, had come to greet him. One after another they thanked him and faded into the light. He then spotted a familiar face. It was Noah's spirit in a soft glowing outline, flooded in a warm, comforting light, appearing to be at peace and no longer in agony. Oliver's heart skipped a beat as he spotted him. The tears started in his eyes. That was his best friend. "Noah?" Oliver whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Noah smiled. "Oliver, you did it. You tapped us free." Oliver got to his feet, with legs still weak. He said, "Noah, I shouldn't have left you." At that moment, Noah held up his hand to stop him. "There's nothing to be sorry about," Noah said. "You stood by your word and had the courage to stay true to your friend in horrible danger. You never once gave up honoring us," tear-filled eyes that brightened as Oliver said, "Thank you for everything." And finally, as Noah's spirit seemed to draw nearer, he whispered, "It was your own strength and friendship that bore us through. We will all sleep now in peace." So, Oliver held out his hands and felt Noah's warm head passing through him as if he were solid. I missed you," Oliver said, managing to force out the words between sobs. Noah's smile came again. "I missed you, Oliver, but now we're both all right. You need to learn to live without this guilt, knowing that I can rest now." Oliver nodded. His heart, which was broken into 2 pieces, is now back in shape. "Thank you, Noah," he said. "Thank you." Noah's glow brightened, his spirit dwindling. "Thank you, Oliver, for a loyal life. Goodbye." From the moment Noah's ghost slipped into the radiance, Oliver felt the sense of an agonizing weight he had carried for years lift from him. He knew that Noah and the other spirits of the missing children he had helped send on their way were finally free. Oliver rolled over, struggled to stand, and with a quivering sense of self-pity dragged himself out of that basement. The school lifted, gained light and airiness. And at last, there was the sun, re-emerging over the slivers of a silent hill. It didn't take long for the word of Oliver's victory to spread across Greentown. The resurrected little heartland village had now started to rebuild. The story of Greentown that had begun with the ghost piercer Jacob William Davis and the demon he had conjured there had now ended. The focal point where the memorial park jutted out from the school grounds had become a relic of where the farmland had been, and had now become a shining exemplar of light pushing back against darkness. And even as Oliver was forever changed, it was all over. His promise to Noah had been kept, and the madness that had haunted Greentown all those decades was finally over. The past remembered no longer then, but instead done. Finished. Greentown was over and beyond its history, beyond a horror that had hovered for 100 years.